Okay, I'm going to talk a bit about feathers today. We're going to review basic feather structure, some patterns that allow feathers, some structures that allow feathers to have their different shapes, um, types of feathers on the body of a bird, types of molts that birds can have, how birds change their feathers, and a bit about feather color. First, let's talk about the structure of a feather, your basic structure. And so there are two major features in your typical bird feather. You have this central, rigid spine-like structure along the middle. We call that the shaft, and that's further subdivided into this area that's closer to the body, what we call more proximal to the bird. It's proximal to this broad part of the feather, and this is called the calamus. And then the area of the shaft that is surrounded by the feather part is called the rachis. So you'll hear shaft and rachis, sometimes calamus used during these discussions. The part of the feather that's further away from the body is the distal part. So those are some orientation terms that you'll also hear. The area around the shaft that we call the feather, we think of that as that sort of flat, smooth, sometimes very colorful surface, is called the vane. And the vane can look different depending on the type of feather you're looking at. Here in this image, they're talking about the pennaceous portion. This is the area of a feather that's really smooth looking, and it's got these interlocking sort of features about it. Most feathers also have a plumulaceous portion, areas where the feather looks like down. It's very floofy and there's no sort of connecting up of those parts of the feather. So those are your basic parts of the feather. Now, when you're looking at this kind of feather, the pennaceous form, it's important to understand how that works. Let's see if I can advance my slide. Okay. So here is a schematic of a feather. And again, we have our rachis, so the part of the feather that's surrounded by the vane, okay? And this little circle is us zooming in to a part of the rachis and then a part of the vane. And so if you look closely at a feather, you can do this often with a magnifying glass. You can see some of these structures. With a microscope, you can see most of these structures. What you'll see is here's the rachis, and from the rachis, most of what we're seeing of this feather are what we call barbs. And so these are also shafts of rigid, sort of straight, rigid structures, and these are called barbs. So that's what's sort of emanating out from the rachis. Now, from each barb, if we look a little more closely at a barb itself, the barbs also have these structures that sort of emerge from both sides of the barb, and those are called barbules. And barbules are what they have specialized structures in them, and they give pennaceous feathers that sort of zipped up quality to them. And so there's a difference in the structures of barbules depending on which direction they're facing. So barbules that are facing distally, so the barbules that are facing towards the tip of the feather, have this series of hooks on them, little looped hooks. And then these barbs that are facing proximately, facing in this direction towards the calamus of the feather, they don't have those hooks, but they have this little curved structure. So when those barbules overlap, you get this hooking of the two barbules together from two different barbs. And that keeps the feather kind of locked together and gives the feather this very strong yet light aerodynamic property. Now, I need to mention that feathers are largely made out of keratin, which is the same structure, the same chemical, that the same molecule that fingernails are made out of and hair is made out of. The keratin that you find in bird feathers is very similar to the keratin that you find in reptilian scales, a little bit different than the keratin you find in mammal hair and nails. So here are some different kinds of feathers. You have two very elongated feathers here. This is a tail feather from a ruffed grouse. This is a wing feather from a parrot. And then we have a few slightly more specialized feathers here, or feathers you may be less familiar with. Flight feathers are highly specialized. This one here is called a semiplume, and it's a feather from a northern cardinal. And you might remember that there was this portion of the feather that we call pennaceous, that interlocking smooth portion, and then the portion that we call plumulaceous. Well, a semiplume is partially plumulaceous, and in this northern cardinal feather, there's quite a lot of this plumulaceous feathering. And plumulaceous feathers are they have the barb and barbules, but the barbules aren't specialized to have that hooked and curved interlocking structure. So the feathers don't interlock, and instead you have this floofy feathery structure instead. And down feathers are particularly good at insulation. So this is a semiplume. It's got a bit of pennaceous interlocking structure and a bit of plumulaceous. This is a contour feather. Contour feathers are found over all of the body of a bird except for the flight feathers. And so contour feathers really they give birds their shape, their contour. And this aids in locomotion, particularly water birds need that sort of aerodynamic shape when they're diving. This also protects the birds. The birds can produce an oily substance, and they use that to preen their feathers, and that gives them some waterproofing. And so contour feathers are your most abundant body feathers. Down feathers. So down feathers can be found in some adult birds. They are found in almost all young birds at least some point of their life, and they are primarily for insulation. And then here is a specialized feather called a filoplume. Now they're found on most birds, but they are not easy to locate. They're very small feathers. They are mostly shaft with a little bit of feathering at the tip. And they're thought to they connect to nerve cells, so they're thought to have a sensory function. And then bristles. Bristles are a specialized kind of feather that's fairly common in birds. Birds can have bristles on different parts of their body, but in a lot of North American birds, we might see the most common place to see bristles are around the mouth. Some birds that eat sort of large prey, insect prey, but use their mouth to catch the prey, will have these bristles, and the bristles protect their faces and eyes somewhat from these large prey. Here's some down. So talking a little bit more about down feathers. Young birds will have a phase of their development where they are covered in down. The down helps them to thermoregulate. And so depending on the state of the bird when it hatches, it may or may not have down on it right away. So here is an example of a bird that we call precocial bird. These birds can walk. They're fairly independent as soon as they hatch. This is a little duckling. They have this thick layer of down. When they're born, they can thermoregulate. They don't need to be kept to be brooded in their body temperature to be kept constant in the same way that other birds need it. Songbirds are altricial. And so instead of being sort of semi-independent when they hatch, they are completely helpless. And actually, many of them have almost no feathering at all when they are first hatched from the egg. But within a few days, they start to grow some down. So when they hatch, they need to be what we call brooded. So the adult has to actually keep the birds warm with its own body until the birds can thermoregulate, until they grow some down and their body size increases a bit, then they can thermoregulate. And then we also have birds that are sort of in between. They're not exactly precocial and they're not all the way altricial, and they will have like these two birds. They're not leaving the nest, but they're capable of thermoregulation, and they have this nice thick set of down on them. Contour feathers. Contour feathers are the feathers you see on most easily seen feathers on the body of a bird. They're not the biggest, they tend to be fairly small in size. They provide a shape, and a lot of the color patterns you see on birds are found on the contour feathers. Contour feathers are really important in the aerodynamic design of birds, both in flight, but particularly in water birds when they're diving. And they're important in sort of the thermoregulation and the protection from the elements, some waterproofing and thermoregulation too. And then flight feathers. Okay. And so we're looking on this crested caracara. We're looking, it's a nice image of its flight feathers. So we have its remiges. So those are the wing feathers. There's two kinds of flight feathers, the remiges, and the singular for remige is rimage. And then the rectrices, which are the tail feathers, and singular would be rectrix with an X at the end. Both are involved in flight. Tails tend to be important in reduction of drag and also in maneuvering. And of course, the wing feathers are very important in all of flying. So here are again, our rectrices and our remiges. And when we look at feathers, people who study feathers and look at birds at different stages of their annual cycles, we have a sort of universal numbering system for flight feathers. And it goes in the rectrix from the centermost rectrices being numbered number 1 out to the outermost. And this bird, it has 6 rectrices on each side, and so they're numbered from 1 to 6. For the remiges, there's 2 sets of remiges, and whether they're called a primary, which are these outermost remiges, or a secondary, which are these innermost remiges, has to do with what bone of the forelimb the feathers are attaching to. So the primaries are attaching to the outermost, sort of the equivalent of the wrist bone of the bird. And then the secondaries are attaching to the forearm, sort of essentially part of the bird. And again, we number them from this center point right here. So with primaries, they're numbered from the innermost, to the outermost primary, from 1, in this case, to 9. Some birds have 9, some have 10. And then the secondaries are numbered, the number 1 secondary is adjacent to the number 1 primary. So they're numbered from the outermost secondary up from 1 to however many. Sometimes there's 7, sometimes there's a slightly different number depending on which kind of bird you're looking at. But the reason they are numbered this way is because of molt, and I'll come back to that in a future slide. Here are some images of birds in different molts, and birds have a structured system of changing their feathers. They don't shed feathers and regrow them like mammals do with hair. Now, mammals can have seasonal patterns of losing hair and growing new hair, but there is a very structured pattern of molt, somewhat more similar to reptilian molt than to what you would see with mammals changing their pelts. So, and birds, for most temperate zone birds, what we find is that they will change all of their feathers, for the most part, in a year. There's some exceptions. Some woodpeckers take a few years to change every single feather, and then some water birds, particularly pelagic birds that spend a lot of time out on the ocean, may take a few years to change all their feathers. But a lot of our songbirds, they change their feathers at least once a year. And for many species, they actually will have a complete molt once a year, often after they breed, and they will molt into often what we call a basic plumage. Now, a lot of birds will stay in that plumage the whole year. Other species may have a partial molt in the spring, right before the breeding season. And that's when they change into, some of their body and head feathers might change into something that's a little more bright and showy. And these are American goldfinches. This is a female and this is a male. And this is the basic plumage that they would molt into the fall and keep throughout the winter. And then this is the alternate plumage for female and male that they molt into in the spring. Here's just another example of birds that have basic and alternate molts where they're changing into more and less showy plumages. Ducks are kind of interesting in that they spend most of their time in a showy plumage, in an alternate plumage. And that's because of their lifestyle. Ducks will pair up, they will mate, well, they'll pair up, pairs will get together on the wintering grounds. Now, but a lot of songbirds, they're not pairing up until they reach their breeding grounds, their spring breeding grounds, but ducks do this on their wintering grounds. So they do this on the wintering grounds and then they migrate together and breed. And so most of the year, ducks are in their showy plumage. So here is a pair of wood ducks. This is from the Handbook of Bird Biology. And this is the kind of plumage you see them in most of the time. This is the male, this is the female. However, ducks do very briefly molt into what we call an eclipse plumage. It's a less showy plumage, but it's very brief. And this happens right after breeding. And this is a time when ducks are also molting their flight feathers. And ducks have an interesting flight feather molt. They molt all of their flight feathers at once. So there's a brief period of time in a duck's life every year that it can't fly. Now, because they can move around on the water, there's multiple ways they can evade predators during this time, but they do molt into a plumage usually that's more cryptic, less obvious, less showy. So here is an image of a male and a female wood duck in eclipse plumage. Now you can tell that this one is a male because it has this little mark on its face, just like the male in the more showy plumage has. And then the female, you'd say, oh, well, this is a more drab plumage, but it is actually there's a lot of patterning here. There's some face patterning and some patterning of dark and white on the body. And that the female loses that coloration as well during the molting time in the eclipse plumage. Mallards, you could go out now and look to see if you can find some mallards in eclipse plumage. You probably can. And you may have in the past thought, wow, there's only female mallards around here this time of year. Isn't that funny? But if you know what to look for, you might notice that some of the birds you're looking at are actually male. So this is what we're used to seeing with a male mallard, okay? This bright green head, the white band around the neck, and then this sort of slate gray body with the curly little tail. So this is a male in its showy plumage, and here is a female in its breeding or its basic showy plumage. So the female has a modeled patterning. And the male, you don't see it here. The female, like the male, has a bright blue wing patch called a speculum. Okay. So, but during this time of year where they're molting their feathers and going into eclipse, they look a lot like this female, but there's some little telltale signs that will let you know what sex and maybe even what age these birds are. So males in eclipse plumage look all brown like this, but they always maintain this very yellow looking bill, and you never see a yellow looking bill in the females. The females always have some amount of orange and sort of darker coloration on their bills. So this is a male in eclipse plumage. It's an adult male. This is a male that's molting back into its breeding plumage from eclipse. So you can see it's starting to get some of the gray and some of the green on the head. It's changing back into the showier plumage. And then this is a juvenile male. And it looks a whole lot like the adult. There's a few things that are different here. You're not seeing as much white on the tail. The bill is still yellow, but it's not as bright yellow. And then there's some differences on the amount of dark on the head. But the bill, again, will give it away. You're not seeing orange and a dark coloration on the bill. And then this is a juvenile female, and it looks a lot like the adult female. We're not seeing that bright blue speculum. So it's kind of interesting about ducks, how that plumage relates to their molting and their breeding strategy. Now, songbirds and lots of other birds have instead of losing all their flight feathers at once, they tend to do it one or two at a time. This allows the bird to still be able to fly. They may have a little more difficulty flying while they're molting, but they can still fly. They can still escape a predator. They can still get from one point to the other. And you may notice sometimes when you look up in the sky in the summer, if you see a raven or a hawk, or often I see this in the bigger birds, a crow, you might say, hey, that bird is missing a feather here and here on same missing feathers on both sides. That's because that bird is molting. And this is the pattern you often see birds molt with. So they'll start by molting flight feather number 1 in their remiges, and then they move on to 2, and then they move on to 3, and they move on to 4. In this case, we're seeing that secondary number 3 is starting to grow in on this bird. On the primaries, it's a little further ahead with secondary 3 also growing in, but a little further along, and primary 4 has been lost and is starting to grow in. But after this, these feathers grow in, 3 and 4 in this case, the next feather will drop and a new one will grow in. Same with the rectrices. Now, a little bit about color. Birds, as we know, have amazing colors. And there are 2 major pigments responsible for bird colors. You have melanins that are responsible for a range of colors from browns to blacks to grays. And also buffy pale yellows. All of these colors we're seeing in these feathers of the Argus pheasant are melanins in different patterns within the cells of the feather. And then we also have carotenoids. Now there's other pigments that cause coloration in birds that are just not nearly as common or as obvious out in nature in birds that we see from day to day. Carotenoids are responsible for bright yellows, like the yellow tail tip of a cedar waxwing, the yellow coloration of this golden palm weaver, and then also the bright red colorations. Carotenoids are produced through the diet. The bird eats certain foods and it allows them to produce carotenoid colorations. Melanins are manufactured within the cells of the bird. And birds often use a combination of structural colors. So the ways that the cells within the feather themselves are structured can cause a coloration. That's called structural color, as well as melanins and carotenoids to produce a plumage that is very colorful. A great example here is the budgeriggar. This is what a wild one would look like. Also, they're popular in pet stores, but this bird's coloration is due to melanins that are absorptive. So they absorb the UV light, and you see these dark colorations from the melanin, overlaid with a coherent blue. So the coherent blue are actually structures within the cells of the feathers that when UV light hits those feathers, blue is reflected back. So it's a structural color, not a pigment. So that's structural blue overlaid with carotenoid pigments. And so what we get are yellows in the carotenoid areas, some structural blues here, like the little mustachial area, blacks, and then the green that we're seeing is this combination of blue reflecting back in the structural color and the yellow carotenoids. Well, budgeriggars can be bred to have different kinds of color patterns. And this one here in B is bred to not produce carotenoid pigments. And so this is what that same bird would look like without any of its carotenoid pigments. The areas that would be yellow are white. The green area is now just that structural blue, and we still have that absorptive melanin patterning on the bird. They can also be bred to produce no melanins, but only carotenoids. And then what you get is this pretty uniform yellow plumage, except these areas that were purely structural, strongly structural. Blue, you actually see some white here. And then you can have no carotenoids, have birds bred that produce no carotenoids in their feather cells. This bird is not an albino, but it's producing none of these layers of melanins or carotenoids. And so what you get is a structuring, or any of these blue structures, you get an incoherent scattering of white back. And so this is an all-white budgeriggar. here's a really great slide from the book. It's a box 4.05 from the book, and it goes through the different ways birds can overlay structures in their feathers, um, melanin pigments and carotenoid pigments or chemical pigments to produce amazing showy plumages, including iridescence, which is this process of different layering in the feather structures in the feather cells that reflects light back at different colors depending on what angle the light's hitting it. So there's lots of variation in the bird world in these pigments and in the structures of the feathers that produce these amazing colors. All right.